Manor is releasing to early access in 2 days, and I wanted to share my thoughts on the game after 140 hours and completing 100% of the achievements. Thank you to the developers for providing an early access key, but this isn't sponsored and I'm giving my own personal thoughts here. I'll start by saying 2 of the achievements were bugged. One of them is just to launch the game for the first time, and the other killing bandits in a non-combat game mode. This should be possible by committing war crimes, starving your people and freezing them to death, having them turn to banditry, and then killing them with your own militia. Sadly, the units that spawn aren't tagged as brigands, which is where I suspect the bug is. Nonetheless, I did complete the 100% if you exclude the 2 bugged ones. Now, I've played a lot of early access titles in the past, and I have to say this one is very polished relative to the industry standard. I'm running an RTX 4080 and 13900 CPU with settings on Ultra across the board and 1440p. I had no slowing, stuttering, or other optimization issues that you typically experience with early access games. The only time I ran into problems was when I pushed the game to its limits. My main town had over 1,000 population, while I had towns in all 8 regions, and a combined population across the map of 2,000 or more. It did stutter and slow down significantly around that point, but again, the game's not really meant to be played at those numbers, or at least not yet. In terms of stability, I did have some crashing issues, around 10 to 15 in total throughout my 140 hours. There didn't seem to be a common theme as to why or when they would crash, but luckily the game has a good autosave function and the loading screens are blazing fast. About 5 to 6 seconds for me with my NVMe drive. In terms of bugs, I've got a small list of ones that I came across. None of them were game breaking though, like not being able to click on a production building. If you save and load, it goes away. Or the granary worker stealing ale from the tavern, but you can just block that inventory from the granary and it'll fix it. So when you compare this list to other games that have been in early access for several years, it's laughable how good Manor is, relatively speaking. Now let's talk about the main gameplay loops. There are 3 main game modes that you can play. The first being a peaceful city builder where all the bandits and enemy AI are turned off completely, allowing you to grow your town in peace. However, that doesn't mean that you can't lose your town, as not satisfying your people's needs could spiral into a negative approval and people will start leaving your town. You can adjust the difficulty downward to avoid this if you want, so it's highly customizable. The main focus here is usually expanding your population, upgrading buildings, managing a complex supply chain, and so on. A perfect example of this would be farming to produce bread. You'll need some spare workers, a farmhouse, and some rich fertile soil to place your fields. Your workers will plow and sow the seeds in the right month, then wait for a full year and harvest the wheat, which is then taken back to the farmhouse to be threshed into grain. From there, it's sent to the windmill to be grinded down into flour. The flour is then taken to a communal oven and baked into bread, but that's not the end of the supply chain yet. Food also needs to be taken back to the granary so the market workers can grab it, and then it can be distributed out to the population to eat. This part of the gameplay loop is extremely satisfying, especially since you can automate all of this without needing any input from the player. The next game mode includes everything we just discussed, but adds in combat, bandit camps, raids, and an enemy baron. While you're growing your town, these bandit camps will periodically steal your shite until you wipe them out, meaning growing an army is a necessity in this mode. Let's briefly talk about combat. You've got 3 different types of troops at your disposal. Militia, which are actually made up of your own workers, your male peasants that must have their own equipment provided to them, and if they die in combat, your economy will actually suffer from a lack of manpower for a time. You can also spend some of your gold to hire retinue troops, which are basically a standing professional army. They're well armored, well trained, but cost a lot of money to hire and upgrade. And finally, you can hire mercenary troops, which are a mix of professional troops with good equipment and special abilities like forming a shield wall, all the way down to rabble who have poor stats and gear, but they cost significantly less. You'll have the standard troop types like archers, fast-moving shielded troops, slow armored spearmen, and literal tanks in the retinue. Once you've established which troops to use, you'll have to fend off raiding parties every few years, or have your towns burned to the ground and all the people slaughtered. And finally, your main objective will be to take the lands of the enemy baron. He'll end up summoning large armies to fight you with each piece of land that you try and take, with the final battle being the biggest, over 1,000 men between both sides usually. But the game doesn't really force you too hard, and you can take the baron's land when you're ready. When it comes to the actual combat, it's pretty similar to Total War. You can place your troops as you see fit, extending their lines or staying tightly packed. There are several factors that determine the outcome of battle, like attack and defense stats, fighting uphill or downhill, flanking the enemy, shooting volleys of arrows into enemy formations, and so on. Each unit can be placed in different stances depending on what you need that unit to do, like placing them in defensive stance, which increases their survivability while sacrificing their offensive output. If the enemy has the high ground, you can engage them and quickly fall back, drawing them off of their hill and negating their bonus. Or you can maneuver your troops for a devastating flank and charge. Again, it's nothing revolutionary, and anyone who's played Total War will feel comfortable here on day one. And the final game mode is a defensive one where your main goal is to grow your town large enough while being attacked by both raiders and bandit camps constantly. To be honest, this game mode is the same as the previous, but without the enemy barons, so it basically plays the same. Now, if you're the type that likes a crazy challenge, you can turn the settings up to the max, starting with 5 bandit camps, being raided on your first year, starting in winter with no resources, and your peasants get pissed off really easily and leave your town quickly. It took me 6 or 7 tries to figure out a good build to even survive the first 2 months, so if you're looking for a good challenge, this is definitely it. Now we need to discuss the most important part of this review. The game is early access, and I mean very early access. If I had to guess what percentage of the game is actually done, it would be in the 40 to 50% range. Most of the perks you get from leveling up your town either don't work or are poorly balanced. The policy page has only 2 that you can click on, and only one of those 2 actually work. The production page is completely blank. I have no clue what that's for. The castle planner that pops up when you place your manor house is mostly cosmetic at this point, with the only building that functions being the tower that increases your retinue size by 12. It also happens to be bugged, and you can place infinite of these towers to get a massive retinue. Speaking of retinue, they do gain XP, but there's nothing to spend them on as the upgrades are all locked. Some items that are in the game have no function yet, like tools, wooden parts, stone blocks, and wax. When you play with an enemy baron, they don't have any AI to manage their city building on his lands, and he simply sends troops from off of the map to contest you. There are a lot of things that are still very much a work in progress, which is fine because it's early access, but I feel like I need to reiterate this so I can temper people's expectations a bit. While it's difficult to remain objective here, given that I've spent nearly 150 hours in a short period of time, but I think I have a good idea of who will and will not enjoy this game in its current state. If you've played games like anything from the Anno series or Banished, or if you enjoy managing supply chains and complex ecosystems, then you'll probably enjoy this one. And if the idea of having to deal with combat and troops makes you nervous, just turn it off. You can play it as a pure city builder. Now, even if you're not a fan of the games I just mentioned, but you are a fan of very complex games that have a lot of options and game mechanics to explore, you might still enjoy this one as well. For example, I love Bannerlord and I love Project Zomboid, for both the same reasons. These 2 games have almost nothing in common, but they are both incredibly complex and have a ton of game mechanics to explore and fun challenges to attempt. Bannerlords, even in its incredibly limited state right now, has this to offer in spades. For example, the current meta is to use trade posts to make a ton of money and buy everything you need and then simply win. But if you're up for a tough challenge, don't allow any trading and try to manufacture everything in-house. You'll be forced to expand into several regions and run multiple towns at once, each one specializing in a few specific goods that all the other towns will need, and then you'll need to create a supply network to distribute these goods to everybody. And if you're on the hardest difficulty setting, doing all this with fickle peasants and enemies attacking you every 6 months is such a fun challenge. Now, on the other side of things, I don't think Manor Lords is for everybody, especially in its current state. If you're the type that doesn't enjoy playing games that aren't finished yet or polished and would prefer to wait for the full release, I would 100% sit this one out for now. As I said before, it's probably closer to 50% being done, and seeing all the missing and broken features can be a little triggering at times. I also think if you're looking at Manor Lords to scratch your Total War-like itch, this is probably not the right game for you. While there is combat in the game and it's really fun and complex, battles are not on the same scale or frequency as Total War games. In most campaigns against the enemy Baron, you'll have 2 or 3 battles, with the last one being against 450 enemy troops, and whatever you bring to the field. Most of my runs last anywhere from 5 to 15 hours, so to get 1 or 2 small battles and 1 large battle at the end might be a huge letdown for those that are looking for a lot more combat. To sum it all up, I think Manor Lords still has a long way to go before it's a fully finished game, but for the right audience, there's enough there that I can highly recommend buying it into early access. I've enjoyed myself so much that I've already spent dozens of hours running tests, collecting data, and working on producing guides for it. Now, if you plan on getting into Manor Lords and you want to avoid some of that steep early learning curve, click this video right here where I show you step by step how to go from nothing to a solid foundational town with money, an army, and a stable population. A huge shout out to Mortismal Gaming for the idea of doing a review after 100%. I put a link to his channel in the description. Thank you to all the Patreon supporters and YouTube members. I appreciate your support.